It is my great pleasure today to welcome you to today's MedVR webinar on the creative science of medicine VR, from prototypes to clinical studies. I'm Julie Lemoyne. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer over at Horizoners. I've been working for over 30 years in advanced technology, and the last 15 have been entirely focused on the strategy and use of 3D gaming and XR across a lot of verticals, including healthcare. Also, I'm in my last year of a Ph.D. in Applied XR and Health and Wellbeing at the University of College in Dublin, where I'm an Irish Research Council Scholar, and I am a visiting scholar at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center at UMass Medical School. It is my absolute pleasure to be the moderator for today's webinar with Dr. Kate Donovan and Dr. Brandon Birckhead, whom I shall introduce in just a moment. As a new organization, I would like to take a second to talk about MedVR. MedVR is a community centered around sharing knowledge about and the development of new applications using augmented, virtual, and mixed reality in healthcare. Our mission is to seed a community comprising of healthcare professionals of all types, along with scientists, developers, designers, technologists, artists, and all kinds of experts, as well as with the end users of healthcare services, to learn together to create the future of using this type of technology in healthcare. This webinar is part of our MedVR online program, which we have designed to offer a year of learning about innovations in AR and VR in healthcare, and as we aim for this to grow a unique and diverse community over the coming year to lead up to a symposium and hackathon event that we'll hold in June of 2020 in Boston. None of this happens without sponsors. So here's a little tiny shout out to our early sponsors. And if your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, we would love it if you would get in touch with us. In creating the 2021 event, we've adopted the model of the Reality Virtually Hackathon from the MIT Media Lab in order to enable our participants to exchange ideas and work together to develop original prototypes with high impact in healthcare. And we actually hope to facilitate further development of the projects from that event through research, commercial funding, incubation, and we also hope to inspire the individuals to pursue their professional interests in this field. In the process, we seek to foster interdisciplinary efforts, combining technical and clinical knowledge in functionally and socially diverse teams to best drive innovation. Even if you can't attend the 2021 event, we invite you to join our community through this series as we learn and grow together. And you can learn more about MedVR and our team and our online program by visiting our website, medvr.io. Okay, so enough about all that. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Donovan and Dr. Brandon Birckhead. Both are innovators in the application of XR in medicine. So I'll briefly introduce them and then we'll give them the floor. So first we'll start with Kate. Dr. Kate Donovan is the Clinical Director of Innovation for the Department of Pediatrics, Simulator Program and Innovation Digital Health Accelerator at Boston Children's Hospital, where she introduced the use of virtual reality and augmented reality for clinical use in education, Dr. Donovan is the co-founder of Hacking Pediatrics and of Health Voyager, which is a VR experience that incorporates endoscopy findings into an engaging platform to educate patients. Dr. Donovan received a BS from Harvard University and a Ph.D., an MBA, and an MS in computer science from MIT, with her research focused on the complexities of integrating data from consumer healthcare applications into clinical care management. Dr. Donovan is proficient in XR technology and shares her passion for STEM with free educational opportunities for at-risk teens throughout the Boston area. I'm always like, so take that. So she's very qualified to be here today. Dr. Brandon Birckhead is a project scientist at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in LA. Dr. Birckhead received his medical degree from the Mayo Medical School and is currently running the Digital Pain Reduction Kit study, which is assessing the use of virtual reality therapy for those with musculoskeletal injuries for 60 days. The use of it for 60 days. This will be one of the largest randomized controlled trials using VR for pain reduction in our fields. He is also the co-director of the Virtual Medicine Conference with Dr. Brendan Spiegel, and that is one of the largest immersive technology conferences focused on healthcare today. Dr. Birckhead began his work in therapeutic virtual reality by helping providers in head-restricted clinical settings, such as dentistry, to use the technology for pain and anxiety relief. In other research, he has collaborated with radiation oncologists to assess the use of VR in medical education and the design of VR breast cancer education for patients to help them understand their radiation treatment. And very importantly, he is also a contributor to the guidelines for future clinical trials within the field of medical VR. So these are both very high-end trailblazers, and this is why we're just so delighted to have them both here today to discuss a set of recommendations for prototyping and studying immersive therapeutics with examples from each phase of medical VR research, as described in the Virtual Reality Clinical Outcomes Research Experts, or the VR Core. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Today we have two sections. We have an area to your viewing right where you can put chat, and I see you're already doing that, talk amongst yourselves and with your audience. And we have some MedVR clinicians and experts in there chatting, and we'll engage with you. If you have a question for Dr. Donovan or Dr. Birckhead, please use the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. And when we get to that point at the end of the talk, we will pull from those questions and go through them. Okay, so without further delay, I will hand the screen over to you. Let me bring my slides down, and Kate, sorry, you can, Dr. Kate, I should say, you can grab that.
Says I'm screen sharing now.
Okay. Okay.
Can make that bigger.
There. I'm going to give your screen the focus. How's that?
Brilliant.
There you go.
All right, can we see it, or is it saying you're screen sharing?
We can see it.
Okay, so you can see it. And this is clear? And you don't see your screen sharing option on there?
Nope, you can close that.
Brilliant. Okay, so click the close message. I'm good with this. Hold on a sec. Brilliant. All right. So thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate it. It's so hard to talk about yourselves when you're in this space, but this is a really fun space. So thank you, Julie, and the MedVR community. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. And of course, Brandon to help me out with this. So I'm going to start out talking about prototyping. For the most part, I'll be using the lens of a clinician. These are the things that I've learned throughout the years when partnering with developers and programmers to execute a technology idea. I think it's really important for programmers and developers, and I probably use two buckets here. Clinicians for me involves physicians, nurses, child life specialists, in that whole group, folks who work in healthcare, and then we have a bucket of programmers, developers, and designers that would be on the other side, which I'll probably use interchangeably, which I know people hate, but that's unfortunately what I'll do here. So hopefully with this, for the programmers taking time to educate, to understand what type of education the clinicians need when actually building out a prototype with them, I think it's really important for them to teach the clinicians some of the terminologies that you guys use often, just as it is for us as clinicians to teach the programmers and developers the terminology we use in our end. So with that being said, you have an idea for a VR experience that's going to transform healthcare. So this is where we're starting. You are absolutely convinced that your idea is going to transform healthcare. And as you've probably, if you've come to any of these other talks, you've seen so many verticals that VR and XR can be used that can really be incredibly impactful in the healthcare space. So one of the things I do, I start with this, which is nicely borrowed from Simon Sinek, is start with why. Why XR? Why is XR what you think is going to help get this to the next level? Are you interested in using VR to solve a pain point or a problem? Is VR the solution that will make the biggest impact? And I caution using VR just to use VR. You don't need to use technology for technology's sake. You want to add value to the end user's experience. So that's something to keep in mind when talking about cool and new technologies. sometimes people just do it as a checkbox to say we have VR in our institution. You really want to be mindful when prototyping and thinking about solutions that you could be building out, that it's actually going to be impactful. You also really don't want to have VR looked at as a gimmick in the healthcare environments, because you can actually create detractors there. It has huge potential, but it also has its limitations. So what I always tell people is your kick-ass idea, you want to do research, and then you want to do research again and research again. Does something already exist in this space? If there's something that already exists, can you build on it to make it better? It's kind of like cars, right? You have cars that go from point A to point B, but my experience in a Tesla is going to be very different than my experience in a Honda Civic. Sometimes what you uncover in research will result in why something actually doesn't already exist in XR. So learn from other people's research to be able to think about the problem differently. And if XR is the solution, you can actually make changes based on that. And also look at the year that the publications happen, because technology obviously is advanced. And perhaps the technology isn't feasible in the clinical space, and somebody already uncovered that. Is the solution you're proposing, this is just to think globally down the line, is the solution you're proposing big enough to scale outside of your hospital, your institution? That's something to think about, because you're going to be married to this idea for a little bit. It takes time for prototyping and actually building out some of these low fidelity and high fidelity prototypes. So you want to make sure that, you know, the money that's being put in, the time that you're putting in actually has an outcome. And if it's scalable outside your institution, there's even potential to partner with some of the startups around here. So is the solution big enough to be scaled? Or perhaps you can partner with folks. And then, of course, look at new and different ways to use the tech. It's not, you know, sometimes we use our headset specifically for 360 environments, but companies like Luminopia use the headset for kids to watch 2D videos. And it's basically used for lazy eye. They watch 2D videos and then they change the lens to strengthen the lazy eye as they watch this. So it's not your typical use of VR, but it's a new and different way of using it. Most healthcare institutions want to see the evidence of technology. I think that's also important too before they make purchases. And then the last thing when thinking about your idea for this initial exploration phase is look around and borrow from other industries to make something truly badass. I use this as a great example. Flight simulation, this started in the early 1900s to practice and prepare for pilots to practice and prepare for unseen events. Medical simulation was borrowed from this, and it's just a different environment where we're allowed to practice and prepare for unseen events. Ultimately, it's to suspend disbelief on both parts to allow clinicians and pilots to practice in a safe environment. So again, borrow from other industries. You think of the tours that happen in the hospital, that was borrowed from real estate folks. So think of how you can repurpose other industries into what you're trying to create. So I'm going to go in just a little bit into some of the terminologies that people are going to hear that they may not understand what the definition is. And I know this for certain with the clinicians. And I also think it's important for, again, the designers and developers to share with them what they mean. So UI, UX, these are the terms that we have heard over and over again. And many of you obviously know what these are, but folks just coming into the field might not. And the clinicians probably that you're building for, perhaps not. So this here, the UI, the user interface, this is really what you can put in there. So it's a broad term, it's a surface layer. What will you be building? What kind of interactions can you put into the experience to allow people to navigate? What tools you need and how to build them to move the experience forward is basically what we have in the UI space. And in VR, it's very different than, say, a website or an app that you create. The user experience, this is probably my favorite space because it differentiates itself between UI because it includes graphics and interactivity. It covers all of what the user will experience. Building out VR requires you to think about the whole human at that. It hijacks the user sensors, so you really need to take that human design into consideration. In addition, it's not just 2D in front of you. You have to think about making those interactions intuitive. Hand gestures is a great example. You don't want folks to stumble around in your experience figuring out how to use controllers if you want it to be intuitive, or else they become frustrated. And what my experience is, if you create detractors in the clinical space with a staff member, they have a bad experience, they're going to showcase that to their other colleagues. So you still have to remember that although we are in a space, there's still a large majority of clinicians who don't know what VR actually is or what the potential is. Storyboarding, this is pretty self-explanatory. It allows you to map out your experience. It's really great to get your ideas on paper when you're working with developers, and it's really helpful for developers to understand what your idea actually is. This is traditionally used for mapping out films and video, basically showing how the experience of the story is going to progress from beginning to end. What differs in VR is you actually have to think about the story in 3 dimensions, as you can see with this slide. It's not just the 2D in front of you, it's what's behind you and the possibilities of creating a whole 360 environment. So storyboarding that can be a little bit challenging because when you have an idea for the healthcare space, you're not always thinking in that 3D environment because you just aren't trained to do that. I always like to share little nuggets when I do presentations, and I don't know if anyone uses Mural. This has been a lifesaver for me. This is one of my favorite mind mapping tools with a ton of templates, including storyboarding, and it also allows for real-time collaboration. So it's basically the Post-it note type of situation. There's a bazillion templates in here. It's a game changer when storyboarding for me when I'm working with partners. Sound is another one, which if you're looking what's behind me, this is a huge thing for me, spatial sound to be exact. Even the simplest execution of this technology can transform your experience and drive the end user to a space when you want them to. Alt Space is a great example if anyone used this. When you're in a headset at the campfire, for instance, you can hear conversations in the distance, which drives the end user to go to that campfire. Persona is the other one. This is where I spend the majority of my time, and I recommend anyone who is in this space to do this. Understand how the technology is going to be used and who you're building for is so, so, so important. This is a mental exercise. People say it's a designer or developer buzzword for the common type of user, but taking into consideration how old they are, how familiar are they technology, how feasible is that technology in the clinical environment. It's incredibly important. In this slide here, you can see so many different types of clinicians here, including a child. How do you build for children, taking into the developmental aspects of an experience? What's going to be for an 8 to 10-year-old is going to be different for a 15-year-old, for instance. And also look at the child's lying down. Are you going to build your horizon that they can actually be supine? It's something that challenged us at Children's as we navigate these waters. And of course, having the design thinking mentality, I think it's really important. So you look at the empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and then test. And Brandon's going to go to that a little bit more as far as the testing is concerned. So why prototype? So you really want to prototype because you want to really convey an idea. You need to wrap your head around the idea, and you can do it low fidelity with just the mock-ups, with storyboarding, or you can build out a low fidelity experience, much like what is shown here. It's not that whole immersive space that you would end up with, but it's enough to get the end user or get some buy-in from folks that are looking to help you build things out. There is a lot of unique visual problems in virtual reality design, like changing depths, recognizable cues, including functions and controls within the environment. So you have to think about those things. There's also the dilemma of immersion. VR design's greatest strength can also be undoing. Everything a user sees and does has to be carefully planned out. You can't overstimulate them with too many elements or bore them with too little. We found this definitely in pediatrics. Sometimes they're looking for a little bit more than what we are looking for. You need to make sure that their next task is clear and the important elements are visible from all angles. Essentially, VR does put more power in the hands of the designer, for better or for worse. And great designers will help the clinicians navigate through their ideas. For sure. And also, it's really helpful to understand the potential of the technology. And we say low fidelity and high fidelity. When you're just prototyping quickly, I always go with the low fidelity just for proof of concept and put it in the hands of people for feedback. And I recommend that in the clinical space. So when you are working with designers, they typically will use the best practices, but it's helpful for clinicians to understand what what some of their challenges are and what they're thinking about on the other side as you're trying to execute your idea. For the most part, your goal is to duplicate reality. So try to relay on as many natural gestures as possible. So when you're thinking about this, the less controls your user has to learn, the easier it will be for them to immerse themselves. Another challenge is letting your user know what they can interact with and how. Because potentially everything in your environment could be interactive, your users will want constant feedback as not to waste time. I think we've all had, if anyone who's been in VR, you've had an experience where you pop up and you're against the wall and you have no idea where you are, it's just completely blacked out. You don't want to have them waste time. When you're walking down the street, there's no hamburger menus in the upper corner like you have on your apps or in your websites and whatnot. So such menus on head-mounted displays counteract VR immersion. So you want to think about that. Maybe you can place a timer or countdowns on an avatar's watch. It just requires creative problem solving, but your users definitely will appreciate the hard work. And aside from the visual challenges, you want to avoid making your user look back and forth between something close and something far, so their eyes don't have to switch focus too often. And try to keep the task visuals at the same level of depth. And that's really from the interaction portion of it. When we jump into the audio and visual, because our own site is curved, it's best to display text and images that aren't part of the environment as slightly curved, concave surface. This lends itself better to the visual immersion and will look smoother for the users when they turn their head. You know, we've tried this even with Google Street View and whatnot. You have that flat surface if you don't do that piece. Speakers are the best audio immersion because you can change the direction where the sound comes from. So you can actually build out for that spatial sound to really get the most impact. Headphones are kind of hard to build out on because they just are, you know, across there. So it's definitely limited, but has its advantage as well. And I always say choose your battles when it comes to rendering avatars. It may be better to have no body at all when you're building things if you are having that, than have one with distraction and imperfections. So definitely take that into consideration. A lot of people like to have these really awesome avatars and then the experience is weird or the avatars look a little bit off and it's just incredibly distracting for the end user. Visual effects. So users, I should say, need to know how close or far away an object is from them and from each other to properly interact. And lighting is a simple tool to be able to do this. Lighting and shadows can help create realistic 3D spaces, as can more modern ones. So taking those into consideration. In this here, I say this for the clinicians so they can hear some of the challenges that the programmers, the designers have as they navigate through the idea that you may have, but just to understand there's possibilities with this. And then of course, you know, human-centered design, it's big. You have to design your body movements to resemble real life for it to be impactful. Remember that we move our limbs in arcs, not straight lines. Instead, we're going to look as though we are robotic. The common but understandable mistake is rigid movements, and it's a dead giveaway about how real it looks. Excessive head movement is what gives some users motion sickness. So in general, you want to avoid making the users move their head around too much. It's best to keep interactive elements between desk level and eye level. So if you're thinking about an educational module for folks, you just want to take that into consideration. It's called the gridlock zone because it's not too high, it's not too low. And when users can see their hands in a virtual environment, it's easier and frankly more fun to interact with objects. Again, this may require creative problem solving, but sometimes it's just as simple as having them carry an object around. I have to say, VR success truly depends on the designers. At this point in time, we're reaching a turning point. The limits of VR design are becoming less about technical aspects and more about the imagination of designers. So consider this a challenge. Virtual reality design isn't a new frontier for sure, but it's difficult to get started out there because it's new and unfamiliar. But for the same reason, there's boundless opportunity. And I think what's really fun working with clinicians is they actually don't know the limitations of the softwares. So they will reach for the sky, and it challenges the designers and programmers to actually come up with something to mimic what they're trying to convey in their experience. So I think for me, that's probably one of the most exciting parts about VR design from there. Again, I talk about tools that I use. I'm a huge fan of Notion. It keeps me organized when I'm working with designers and programmers, and it keeps all of my projects just intact. It has built-in templates and full databases that you can integrate with this, and it's really nice on the go on an iPad and an iPhone or any smartphone, obviously Apple girl. But I have a huge recommend. I don't own anything in these companies, by the way, so don't interpret that as me doing that. The other thing I'll say is don't be afraid to pivot your idea. This here was an idea that we had to expose children to a gastroenterology procedure unit prior to endoscopy procedures. Our mindset was if we educate them about the space, they would be more prepared as they came in. As we built this out, which is it's pretty low fidelity, and we borrowed from another industry, which is real estate, to do a quick 360 tour of the environment and give information on that. We realized this actually wasn't the space that they were anxious about, because typically kids would get pre-medicated prior to going into this space. So this wasn't the problem. So we found this out as we built this out, and then we tested it with patients. And I talk about the pivot that ultimately turned into Health Voyager, which you talked about earlier, Julie mentioned earlier. So we pivoted from exposing folks to the environment to exposing folks to their actual diagnosis. And this is a experience that can take a patient's actual information from their endoscopy procedure and plug it in a drag and drop interface, which then can be put on a smartphone for patients to look in VR view, if you will. So we give kids the foldable VR glasses with 230mm lenses are about $1 to be able to experience their diagnosis. And they can see where any disease is in their GI tract and understand a little bit. And our intent is that they share this with friends and family so they can understand what the disease is. I think a lot of times with GI diagnosis, it's hard to explain, and it's a tough one to deal with for a lot of folks because of the symptoms that they may have. But even with this, we pivoted again with an idea, because we realized that when we put a child in VR, we're removing the parent from it. So the kid was learning, but the parent wasn't. So we realized that we needed to make something on the iPad so the physician can sit with the parent and navigate the 360 space with the parent so they can see while the child is in VR as well. And again, this really goes from being empathetic and studying the end users that you're building for. So I think that's real important. Now, for the clinicians who are interested in jumping into the space just to explore what they can build out without a designer or programmer, you don't have resources, there's a ton of tools available. So I'm going to quickly go through these. So here's my tools thing. And I know Julie's probably happy that this is up here. Unfortunately, I am a Mac girl, so I don't use this, but I've heard great things about this. And it is free, as you can see. So really easy to prototype and mock things up quickly. Most of these VR experiences are built on game engines, and one of those game engines, which the majority of people know about, is Unreal. And Unreal offers a learning portal that can be accessible, and you can learn certain pieces of how to build out this, even in games. So a lot of borrowed from the game industry, as you can see. Unity is what I use. I've used Unity for a while. I have to say I struggled a little bit as I was first learning, because I was using a free, not a paid subscription. I didn't have a license for this, but the cool thing is in June, they now offer the Unity Learn Premium for free. So everybody has access to the entire learning platform, which is just a game changer in my book. I give this to my students. They love working in Unity. I'm not picking one gaming engine over the other, by the way. So because I know it, I use it. It's like Apple versus anything else. It still pretty much can build the same. Firefox Reality, picking up A-Frame. That's another one that you can head on with a ton of educational opportunities available on there. And then there's also 360 video. Now, this is a space I spend a lot of time in. I'm a huge fan of the 360 environment, capturing it with video. I actually created a 360 environment outside of Children's Hospital probably about 9 years ago, before Google Street View was even available. And I wouldn't necessarily call it 360 because it was very flat, but it allowed people to go in and see when the buses were coming, how much parking was at the time, where Starbucks is, and things like that. There are a ton of consumer cameras on the market that are easy to use, that their stitching software is just phenomenal, and it's easy to build a quick prototype up if you're looking to create a 360 environment to educate folks in that space. I'm a huge fan of the one in the middle. That's the Insta360. I honestly could talk about cameras for like hours. So if you want to have that conversation, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to do that with you. But easy to execute. You want something that's easy to use and easy to get there. Another one is FrameVR. This is in its beta, but allows you to create 360 environments, but also create an educational front room, if you will. So you can basically decorate, as I say, any of the walls in this 360 space to get information across, whether it be a video or photos or a link out to some information on the web. You can also put 3D models in here. So we created one for our simulation program that has 3D models of lungs that you can actually walk around in the environment, which is kind of cool. And this is free currently. Again, it's in its beta. There are some bugs along the way, but they're looking for feedback, and I say jump into it if you're interested in that. And then, of course, there's other free tour softwares available that you can look at. There's a ton of tour softwares available if that's the space you want to go. So again, explore what's out there. Use Google. Google is your friend. And with this here, actually, this is Google. This is Google Tour Creator. So if you wanted to do an easy tour creator, Google Tour Creator is also available. Just take into consideration, if you are using the clinical environment, be mindful of having patients and families in your images. And also if you want it to be private versus open source, if you will, and anything Google I consider open source. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague. Do you want me to stop sharing, my friend?
Yeah, Julie, great. It already looks like it's focused in. So
Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Kate. Love all your tips. Those lists, I'll be honest, like it could take years to figure out all those good tips with just piloting and prototyping, as well as I've bookmarked several more of your slides as tools I want to check out. So what I'm going to focus on for everyone is a little bit of thought around, okay, so let's say you think there's something that's really of interest that could be great for healthcare. How do you go about publishing this, finding evidence? And so a group of a lot of researchers got together and started discussing this. And I think that this is just one way to look at it of how to go about publishing and testing out your idea. So we've called this the VR Core Virtual Reality Clinical Outcomes research and so model. And so what this is essentially a 3-phase model, and it's very similar in parts to the FDA, but we'll talk a little bit where that changes. So the reason why this is different from the FDA model, which may have just like a pilot study and then a initial efficacy study and then a big large randomized study that you'd see for an FDA trial for approval from the FDA, is the VR1 study. And so what a VR1 study is where you focus on exactly what Kate's talking about, that prototype stage, that human-centered design portion. Because as we know, this is a cognitive intervention that requires engagement. And because of that, the whole premise, any mechanism you're working with requires engagement. Otherwise, the person closes their eyes, turns away. I doubt you'll get a clinical outcome, right? So because of that, it really hinges on this being centered around the user that you're focused on, in this case, the patient. And so talking about how to protocolize and even publish something related to that is a little bit what we'll talk about. And then the next two sections are kind of what you probably are thinking about when you think about a clinical trial. I'll try to view this, and I know in the audience we have both developer, the development side, and probably the provider side. So if you're a developer, at the very end of this talk, we'll talk about what kind of groups you may want to interact with to meet the people you need to meet to be able to get this in a hospital, because you do have to find a provider, likely provider or maybe an undergrad campus that can help you find ways to get through a formal evaluation process. So you have to have IRB approval, institutional review board approval. And so because of that, you need to find a good network, and we're going to try to help you with that, connecting you with the right groups, this group. And also for the future ones, that will also come with connecting with the right people. And then for the providers, you know, connecting with these groups as well to find those people who make the actual content. So let me just go, okay, next one. So this one's putting patients first. So it's human-centered design. You've got to understand the patient and their expectations of VR. And because they can be very different all throughout the years. We've definitely seen in our studies, different people from different backgrounds have different expectations. And so the process of doing something like this, you have your prototype. Even before your prototype, but even before that, to take the step of observing this population, this patient group in their environment, either in the clinic, let's say it's in the inpatient unit, or in their home, or in the outpatient setting, and really understanding and empathizing with what is their situation, what are the pain points, because a lot of times many groups will just throw a very fancy technology and it will not do well. If you're wanting to make this for an elderly population, taking something that was built for a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old gamer is not likely to do well. And there's a lot of changes that need to be made from the ground up. Then there's this group ideation stage. So even before we even set code and execute, there's this process of trying to combine all these ideas, because there's so much complexity around the end user, what they want, and how that can be achieved, right? And Kate talked about, in 360-degree world, you have so many more possibilities of directions, of interactions that need to be thought about. And the next thing is to be iterative in your prototyping. Iterative means that you can do a lot of this even on the back of a board. So talking about this observation stage, you know, this could be through interviews, formal interviews. For those that are in user-centered design or design-related undergrad or graduate programs, you probably know a lot about human-centered design, that what type of information you need to garner. But these can all be done through focus groups. This one's actually was done in a focus group that was with our lab to look at how could VR be used to help provide education around healthier diet in a specifically historically African-American church. And so that was a really interesting outcome, because of this impact, they actually incorporated the pastor for that specific church into the VR experience. And that had a huge impact on engagement. And I think that was really impactful and insightful to go through this process to gain that information. So talking about Sketchboards, so before even opening up the laptop, storyboarding things out, mind mapping it, finding what's appropriate, but also what fits your budget. You don't have $200 million budgets. Many times these are early stage prototypes are lean budgets. So you have to be able to find the way about both achieving your goal with what you have for resources, for what you have for your dev team. And again, doing all this before coding, we think will save you time and money long term. All of these things like mind mapping and storytelling, that all can be part. If you are to publish this, that can be part of your publication with figures, graphs, whatnot. The iterative stage, again, we think the biggest thing is you get positive feedback, but the biggest thing is that we do think this will save you time and money to be iterative, to have you maybe likely what we think for publications, you could do probably like 3 cycles. The first cycle might just be on a cardboard sketch out. The second cycle might be your initial alpha. And then the third cycle might be, now that we have kind of the overall mechanics of everything down, what would this more closer to final version look like? And it may take multiple more cycles, but at the very least, kind of looking at it from a 3-stage process. And so now I'm going to switch to the VR2. This is where many of you will think about VR and what it should look at. So let's say you have something now, you've assessed, at least the initial prototype itself. The next step isn't necessarily to go straight to, is this going to reduce, let's say, pain? The next step is actually acceptability. And why is that important? Because if you think you may have the best program in the world for a baby boomer population, you should definitely find that out. And there are companies and there's stories in the past where this was not done and we didn't get an acceptability percentage. And having something that's unacceptable but highly efficacious, not going to scale. So that's a very important thing to figure out early on. Again, this could be done in the focus groups and VR1 stage, but if not then you need to do it in kind of a subsequent study. The feasibility of this. Now this gets to a bigger question that's probably growing over time, which is, okay, how do we integrate this? How does this integrate with the clinical team? How does this integrate with what the current specific clinical setting that you're in? Because it will be different potentially. And you need to be able to assess that. This is also where feasibility can come into the area of frequency and dosing. I would say this area is probably one that, even though this happens in a VR2, probably in a VR3 or a large study, is also where many of these are still being fleshed out. How feasible at scale, how feasible at a larger sample size. But it's all about how does this fit into the practice, or how does it fit into the setting of the patient's home, and then also what amount. But definitely big questions that we have right now in the field. Tolerability. So some people asked in the chat, I've already answered some questions in there, at least from my perspective. This is a thing. This is definitely something we want to assess. I do think things are improving overall, but I think that, you know, discomfort and all the effects, not just the VR side effects or sim sickness or cyber sickness, but any other ill will, emotional feelings, these need to be recorded at any study. VR1, VR2, VR3. And so definitely something we need to look at all times, but definitely at the very least, if it hasn't been yet, by VR2, a second study. This is where we get into efficacy. So this is kind of what you think people are looking at. What's an outcome that you want to look at? So in our case, it could be, for my type of lab, it would be, how does this affect your pain with activities? How does this affect your pain level? And then you have to look at, are these validated scales? You find that in the literature. You just need to justify it in the beginning, even if you can't find something validated or published several times and shown to be of real use through testing. You know, it does not have to be a randomized controlled trial. That's not until we get to that next stage. And that's the final one. So when we talk about the VR3, this is kind of where you hear about like a larger study. That's something you could use if you were going to go to the FDA and try to get approval, or maybe go to an insurance company and say, I think that my thing should be what you would bill, or you should pay for it. Likely all of them are going to say, show me data. When they say show me data, they usually mean this. And so this is where you really have to be clear about the patient population. You really have to target things down. This probably will start to appear as you're going through the other studies, what types of patients are fitting into my earlier studies. This is more of a resource, so tighter templates are just fantastic for that what, why, when, how much. If you could fill out one of these, you're about 99% better describing your intervention than most people or startups I know. So just, if you could fill one of these out, even just on your own, it's a great just thing to be able to do. It's a feat, but it also helps with going through this type of level where you're needing to really be able to describe this to hundreds of patients. This is where things get really interesting. Of course, maybe I'm biased. This is where I have a lot of my interest in that. What types of control do you have here? I've been really focused on placebo VR. And I'll talk about that for a second. But it's just, what is that control? Is it a non-immersive VR? Is it 360-degree video versus computer generated? Is it usual care because, you know, for whatever reason you can't add in another headset? I'm at the big point that we should have some type of headset or some type of digital intervention, if possible, just because the world is digital, and you know, you should have some type of active comparator, because that's what's fair. Most patients, if they're going to be in a study, just giving them nothing isn't really a great outcome unless you really have to. And it should be based on your mechanism of action. That can be hard to figure out, but if you're the group you're with has an idea, or you have an idea, if there's a key moment in the program that you think is so critical, then that control should not have that key part, right? Like the key part of your game design that you think is so much needed. The rest of this, again, I don't want to dig too much into this because I want to have time for questions. And so there is a big thing on blinding. How do you blind? How do you conceal allocation? There's lots of great resources on, again, from kind of the consort group on what you need to have for a trial. I think for those that are interested, you know, feel free to check out our website at virtualmedicine.health. For more info, we have lots of videos, talks from Kate and others. And, you know, I think with that, I would just say that, you know, we can chat about. I've also had several prototypes and they talked about that during my intro. But I think I'd like to get to questions. So I think with that, oh no, we want to get to resources. And so Kate, you want to pop back on, but we both are just huge fans of meetup groups. And I think those are hugely important. And really, MedVR, Kate, came out of a meetup group, right?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. You can just connect with so many people from different backgrounds. And I would say when you're building out prototypes and even exploring this space, different backgrounds really will move your ideas forward, because people think of things so different than what you're thinking like.
Oh, and what about this, Kate?
Yeah, Grand Hack, that's happening virtually in October. So this is a healthcare hackathon out of MIT's Hacking Medicine. This is an online event this year for obvious reasons, but it's not VR specific. However, you can build out VR on here. There's a ton of VR there. It's a great program there. What else you got?
We got Reality Hack. This is where my first hackathon was kind of like this kind of hackathon, focused on VR. It does not specific to healthcare, but it is another VR hackathon that will probably have healthcare related tracks.
And again, these expose you to the technologies, to the different types of headsets, to the potential of the technology and feasibility.
And then Kate and I did a hackathon. I would not have facilitated a whole hackathon without Kate. Has so many years of experience, but she had a fantastic idea of doing an online hackathon with virtual medicine this year. And I'm so glad she did, because as you all know, with the pandemic, many conferences shut down, ours included. The only thing we really had for this was actually this online hackathon. And I had a fantastic time working with Kate and seeing all the great programs and demos that people made.
That was fun.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the last one. There you go. You can't miss on this one. This is why we're all here.
And this definitely, for all the people in the hackathon, for both the providers and those that are developers, this is where you should go. This is where you should explore, test, connect, and I think you'll find those people to do all the above that you're interested in. So I want to take this time to ask any questions. I know I try to answer some questions in the chat, but I guess we should. Kate, there were definitely some that I wanted to leave or felt that you would have a lot of knowledge on. There's some questions on intuitive design and metrics of it, and what you use for metrics. So I don't know. I feel like I end up wanting to say I like to talk to the patient, but I mean, if there's a standardized metric, I'm actually curious for you. What is your standardized metrics for intuitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, you and I are both in the clinical space, so we're looking at it from the research lens. And I think that capturing metrics typically does involve the patient. However, there are things like heat mapping that you can build into your experiences, where you can identify that people are looking at a specific space in a longer period of time. I use that for a build out with the teen advisory committee at Boston Children's, when we created a 360 environment in the operating room. And that heat mapping allowed me to see where the spaces that they were most anxious in, and the things that they were most interested in learning more and were spending a lot more time looking at. So I think there are technologies you can definitely build in. People are building analytics into a lot of these that you can follow as well. Companies like Verti, and just name dropping a few of the companies that I work with, and I'm not married to anything, by the way, including the Unreal Engine or the Unity. I just say that. I see a thing like Unreal's awesome. I'm like, yeah, it's just I know Unity just like I know Apple products versus Microsoft.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And let's see. The other one's insights from user testing process. Can you share insights from user testing process, creative ways to measure and capture metrics of efficacy? Efficacy. So you brought up a good thing about heat mapping. Efficacy is challenging. We've been trying to look at biometrics and how biometrics should be used, so wearable technology to get to outcomes of efficacy. If and when you can do that, you should, but it is challenging in general to get something that's that really gets efficacy outside of a patient-reported outcome. Yeah. I don't know, Kate, if you have anything on efficacy measures.
Well, I think it's interesting because sometimes you uncover things you didn't expect, and then that changes your direction. So for instance, I was using VR for pre-endoscopy procedures with kids in the pre-procedural area. And basically, it was a feasibility study. I wanted to see if this actually impacted the nurse flow. So that was what my question was, is does this impact the nursing flow? I put it in the hands of the kids because they were in VR and they were completely immersed. They didn't require pre-procedure medications. So my question was answered that yes, it did impact the nursing care at the beginning because the kids were in these experiences. But then the child went through the endoscopy procedure, went to the post-anesthesia care unit, and spent less time there because there was less medications on board. So the outcome of that was very different than the question I was looking at. Sadly, it wasn't part of my research, so I had to go back to the IRB, which if anyone's played in the IRB in hospitals, it's a tough space. But I think there's many ways that you can look at that. You know, if it's for pain management, if it's for physical therapy, those metrics are going to be very different.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's see what else we have here. There's a couple towards the bottom.
Hey, can I make a quick comment? This is Julie.
Hi, Julie.
On that one of the more interesting things that I've been working around in the area of intellectual disabilities and the use is that VR can be used to check efficacy, right? So I think we think about using it as a treatment or as an educational, but here we may have an opportunity to think even broader and say, well, okay, in some cases we have in-person or physical, clinical treatment, and we have no way, it's really difficult to check efficacy. And so I'm doing a little work in that area to maybe do a grant in the next year or so in that area. So
to create a measure or to create a check for efficacy of it?
So efficacy of physical or virtual therapeutics. So it's, I think, sometimes when you just turn yourself a little sideways, like you're saying in the 360, Kate, you're like, oh, so with these things that we have a really difficult time checking efficacy, like in the real world, how do you send them? You put a camera on their glasses? I mean, like, what do you do, right?
Yeah.
And so the notion that you can come in and try something in VR to see if the treatment you've had, whether it was VR or some other therapy, is holding, we may see some promise in that area.
Right.
Absolutely.
I'll give a quick example of a silly thing that happened for us. Is I use VR for distraction for kids at Children's as well. And I put a headset on a child, and this was the older Samsung headset, so you don't really know what's going on. The child was in it for about 15 minutes, completely fine, went through the blood draw and everything. I took the headset off, and I said, how was the experience? He said it was black the entire time. But even just being in that space and the blackness to remove them from the environment was actually effective.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have another one on education, and I guess we both have done one. And so how do we, using it for healthcare professionals, I think that's very common. I would say actually healthcare professional is probably one of the most common use cases of education within healthcare. And as far as MVPs, I think that guidance or advice, I would say, building it with them is always best. I think if you come in with something, it can be very well polished, but if you just kind of throw something at a group, I think each one ends up being very tailored. The most successful ones are very tailored to that specific experience. But Kate, you're partly out of the simulation center, or always in simulation centers. You probably see this type of thing and interact with providers on VR education all the time.
Exactly. My colleague Jeff Jacobson, who many of you know, he's working very hard in getting this in the hands of clinicians at Boston Children's. And again, you have to think of the end user and how impactful this is going to be, the cost saving. Currently, as we look at this in the time of COVID, the use cases seem to be escalating because we don't have other options, particularly in the simulation environment where we're typically doing that hands-on approach to things. So picking out and choosing the companies you're partnering with, and there's a lot of folks. It's a crowded space for sure in the simulation suite, but for most places, VR pretty much falls under the simulation suites, and definitely for SimPeds, it falls under ours. But potential, again, is pretty great. And the other thing is you can build your own, which is kind of cool too. So I look at it from that aspect. And again, you want to look at what your hospital and your institution is using. Does it integrate with other learning management systems? Some of those potentials. Like ultimately, as clinicians, we are pretty hands-on. So this is sometimes too far away for some of the clinicians. For nurses, for example, it's just not intuitive to them. So you have to just take your end user into consideration. I always say technology is a companion, right?
Yeah.
So, use it as a companion, build it that way. You probably, go back and forth, flip flop a bit.
Yeah.
I love it for education, though. I think it's huge. So much potential.
Absolutely.
And even for kids. I mean, the Health Voyager is education for kids. It's just so much potential.
Particularly 360. I know we talked about that a couple days ago, but I just think there's so much there, and it's so readily available. So I guess the last one, there's one more that is getting 4 votes, so it's rising up to the top. So it's a discussion of the current state of biofeedback and neurofeedback tools in conjunction with VR. So this one, whole little plug to our hackathon.
There you go.
I was really impressed with people incorporating EEG. So this is I'm gonna mess it up, but it is essentially what it is a cap that you put on your brain that can read the electrical impulses coming from the brain. And they did a fantastic job gamifying that and creating an ability to assess, focus essentially for an ADHD tool, support tool. And I think EEG is very interesting. I think that with Muse, a lot of people are combining the Muse is I think another type of headset with EEG pads on it. I think that there's Neurable. Is that another one that's there's HTC Vive has an adaptable thing that's Neurable, and I think that all that is very interesting, very fun to work with. I've seen it at hackathons. Any of that sounds great. I've also, of course, seen breathing. There's also within some of our clinical trial now, one of our vendors has breathing feedback. So Applied VR has a breathing feedback. And I'm trying to think, what else have you seen?
There's a lot out there, actually. Sadly, because I'm in kind of the hackathon space, I see a lot of hacked things at this. But again, they're prototyping, and the potential is endless. I always say, look at the technology and what you can do with it. The one of the things that we didn't dive deep into on purpose, frankly, is the hardware. But there's so much available, and it's pretty cheap to build out some of these ideas when you're talking about adding some of these solutions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You guys should definitely come to MedVR Hackathon and all of these hackathons. It's
absolutely.
Someone asked about Twitter handles. Mine's just BJ and then my last name Birckhead. Kate, what's your
mine's handle? Annoying. It's _Kate_D. I'll put it in. I'll put it in there because.
Yeah, I'll put it there. Mine too. Yeah, in the chat. Yeah. So, thanks so much, everybody. I don't know if
okay, guys, I'm gonna. I think we're done a solid job. You guys are really awesome to put up the ongoing questions. Brandon, you were doing like triple time there. That was really great. So I want to thank everybody for coming. And we do have an upcoming talk on the August 26th. Let me see if I can share that. Let's see. Having a little share issue. Maybe I can't share my screen on that one. There it is. Okay, let's see if I can get that up there for everybody. Okay, great. And so I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you guys for doing such a wonderful talk. Really interesting. I love the mix between the medical side and the tech side. I think we're doing ourselves a good service for everybody in the audience. And just a reminder, if you want to take a look at this talk, it's been recorded, and all of the previous 3 talks have been recorded, and we've had some wonderful talks so far. And we are moving into a full year, and we have some additional curriculum that's coming down the road, but right now for sure we have the August 26th panel. We have a panel of experts working in the field, and they're in different roles. I think we actually have a speaker from the FDA coming to that one as well. So that's going to be a really interesting talk on August 26th. And thank you again to Dr. Birckhead and to Dr. Donovan. And that would conclude our program. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you on August 26th.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.